Hello, everyone. It's Francis Widdowson here. I just wanted to do a short video to recap what happened at the Free Speech Union panel in Toronto. That was a couple of days ago. And because I wanted to get this done, because I'm heading off to Victoria tomorrow for the release of the documentary Making a Killing, and then we're going into University of Victoria on December 2nd with Dallas Brody and Jim McMurtry to do the Billboard Francis kind of approach at University of Victoria. And I've been doing research all day on the University of Victoria, and it is crazy in terms of the stance that they have taken on the unmarked graves. They have just continuing with this falsehood, and we really need to get in there to have a challenge to the propaganda that the president and the vice president, Indigenous Affairs, have been putting forward for the last 4.5 years. Anyway, what I want to do today is just talk about the Free Speech Union event because I owe Jonathan Kay an apology, and I'm sincere about that. In the heat of the moment, and doing a bit of a barn burning kind of speech, I called Jonathan Kay a coward, and that was wrong. And it was just the heat of the moment, and I'd sort of like to, you know, say what would have been a more appropriate course of action than me doing that. And for people who don't understand the backstory for this, a number of weeks ago, Jonathan Kay was giving an interview in Kelowna, and he said that he had an issue with me because I was insensitive, and what I was doing at University of Manitoba and University of Winnipeg was essentially going into a church and telling people that their dogma was really silly or something like that. And unfortunately, I never really got a chance to talk very much with Jonathan Kay due to the circumstances, and I only bumped into him for a brief time as I was rushing to get myself a glass a glass of wine, which maybe somewhat explains my outburst. Um, and he was talking with Neil McLaughlin, who I'm also very upset with because Neil McLaughlin is a professor from McMaster, and he said that it was justifiable that I was not being reinstated because of this kind of friction argument that was being put forth by the arbitrator, and Neil McLaughlin saying that is justifying the destruction of tenure at universities. So I find, anyway, Neil McLaughlin, Jonathan Kay were talking as I was rushing to get a glass of wine, and I saw Neil McLaughlin, and I said, and Jonathan Kay, and I said hi, and I said to Neil McLaughlin, I've got a bone to pick with you as well. And so I was all kind of fired up. And as I went into this discussion, first of all, I took Jonathan Kay to task for calling me a former academic. And I said at the beginning, before I began my presentation, this is going to be very insensitive, which was a direct kind of jab at Jonathan Kay, because Jonathan Kay had said I've been insensitive. And then I said, I am not a former academic, because Jonathan Kay had called me a former academic. I am a wrongfully terminated professor who is demanding reinstatement. And this is going before the Labor Relations Board on December 3rd. And the arbitrator found that I'd been wrongfully terminated, but said that I could not be reinstated because of friction, which exists because activists feel unsafe because I say there are only two sexes, that Indigenous science is not science, and that the residential schools were not genocidal. And then I talked about how this friction is continuing on with the cancellations that have happened, and at the University of Lethbridge, at the University of Regina, and the University of Manitoba, demanding that between $2,000 and $5,000 in security fees be obtained from me, from my organization, the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship. And this is due to equity, diversity, and inclusion ideology, of which indigenization is a major factor. And this has resulted in what I call the university's Hall of Shame. And the university's Hall of Shame includes Mount Royal University, University of Lethbridge, University of Regina, and then, of course, Thompson Rivers University, and then University of Manitoba and University of Winnipeg. And what is to be done about this terrible situation of shutting down speech, and having that situation at University of Winnipeg where Daniel Page feared for his life. That was how bad it was. And so I'm saying to Jonathan Kay at some point during this discussion that the time for sensitivity is long past, and that in order to do things about this, we can have getting rid of political statements, we can have governance, changes to governance, but the most important thing to do is changing the culture. And culture is the most important, because if you just change the bureaucratic and legal procedures, you'll have a workaround by the professors and the administrators within the system. So you really have to change it so that professors, students, etc., will start valuing open inquiry and critical analysis. And how you do this is you do this with Spector Street epistemology, which breaks down the censorship and the self-censorship. And I'm traveling across the country, and that's how I'm compiling this Hall of Shame, this university's Hall of Shame. And that the University of Winnipeg is in the worst scenario, and this has involved the administration and the faculty association. The faculty association said that there was a denialist on campus spreading lies, and that this should be combated. Then a whole bunch of gangsters showed up in combat fatigues, and I was saying at this presentation for the Free Speech Union, this should have been national news. This happening, these gangsters and basically the complete breakdown of civilization. But besides the Free Speech Union and the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms and some of the non-mainstream media, there's been silence. And even Jonathan Kay didn't cover this situation. And so I really put him on the spot. And then I said, why are they not covering this? It's because I'm insensitive. I'm evidently insensitive. My tone is abrasive, and my word choice is offensive. For example, I asked the question about the hoax, whether it's a hoax or not, at the University of Manitoba, and I refuse to censor Pierre Valliere, the Quebecois Marxist Pierre Valliere, whose book title is White Niggers of America. And this has been an ongoing problem and resulted in Gabrielle Weaselhead mobilizing an anonymous student-led group against me, and I will not do it. I will not censor a book title. Pierre Valliere used that title for a reason, to draw attention to the fact that terrible treatment, discrimination, and belittling of groups happen because of class, not race. That was the point he was trying to make in a very, very strong worded fashion. And what's happening is you have people saying, the book title White N-Words of America, and I'm just not going to do that. I'm not going to censor Pierre Valliere. And this is very important, not to demand people be censored, because you can't really separate form from content. The form often helps us to develop our ideas in a stronger and a more convincing way. And therefore, what's happening is this demand for sensitivity, just sort of letting it lay there with Jonathan Kay, is actually destroying freedom of thought and our ability to pursue the truth at a time when this is most needed. And there's a number of other people on the panel. Geoff Horsman, who is a really thoughtful guy from Wilfrid Laurier, um, a physician by the name of Kaur, Kaur. Sorry, I hope I didn't mispronounce that name. She was having difficulties in the criticizing the lockdowns and the vaccine mandates as a physician. Bruce Pardy, who has some very interesting comments to make about the law and the problems of, you know, the idea of the public good and the law determining the public good. And it's basically the authority. So whatever sort of that institution with authority has determines what is the public good. I thought it was fascinating, a fascinating discussion. And then Jonathan Kay. And so Jonathan Kay, when he was doing his presentation, was talking again, brought up the fact that I'm going into University of Manitoba. I and going to a church, kind of I'm going into this what it really amounts to, a church of Aboriginal people, I guess. And I don't know exactly what he's talking about, but I think he's talking about the sacred fire in front of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. That the fact that I was doing my session in front of that, this is a problem, and you've got to give people a way out. You can't be so strident in how you oppose them. And anyway, as he's saying these words, I wrote down, and Geoff Horsman had done a presentation. Sorry, that was the big part of the story. He said there's two problems that we're facing: mendacity and cowardice. So mendacity is when you're looking after your career and you really are doing things so that you're going to look better, and it's a intentional effort to mislead people in your own interest. And then there's just cowardice. You're fearful of what's going to happen to you if you criticize things. And he was talking about how people were telling him not to criticize EDI because he had a young family, and you should be thinking about your family. So as Jonathan Kay was saying this, I wrote in my book, "Coward," in large letters on my pad, and I showed it to Geoff Horsman, and Geoff, just kind of looked at it. So when we were being asked questions, I said, because Lawrence Krauss was not didn't really want me to be having this kind of disagreement with Jonathan Kay, so he asked some other kind of questions. So I said, but before I get to that, I just wanted to because I don't want to talk behind Jonathan Kay's back, because of course Neil McLaughlin was talking all about me on the heterodox listserv or whatever without my knowledge of him doing that. So I was pretty pissed off about that. So I was saying, no, you really shouldn't be talking about people behind their back. So I said, I wrote coward. I think you're a coward for what you're doing. That's what I said this. And yeah, so that was wrong to say that. And I apologize. I completely apologize for doing that, because Jonathan Kay is not a coward. He's actually a very brave individual, and he's very brave on a number of files. It seems with respect to the Indigenous file, you know, there's a somewhat of an action of cowardice that is going on there. So it's kind of a cowardly action that's happening with respect to this particular instance. And I think that's a much better way to phrase it. And although it is a criticism of how Jonathan Kay is acting in this particular instance, not a general characterization of him, I think that's something that almost everyone that I know faces, is that we are brave in certain circumstances, and we exhibit cowardice in others. And there's been a few moments in my own life where I exhibit cowardice. And one of them is the vaccines. I really do realize that I was very reluctant to speak out against people who are being persecuted about the vaccine mandates. I should have spoken out more, but you get trapped into these, echo chambers, and you're afraid of being called an anti-vaxxer or something like that. And I had more trust for the medical authorities a number of years ago. So I apologize for everyone who I didn't really support enough in terms of your principled stance over what you saw was a, medical malpractice issue. And then the Israel-Palestine conflict. I'm somewhat cowardly about that, exhibit cowardice, because I am a pro-Palestinian person. I'm a critic of Israel and also a critic of religions, all religions, including Judaism. But I know that a number of my supporters are, heavily into the Zionist side of the Israel-Palestine conflict. So it makes me somewhat reluctant to kind of let my views be known in various contexts. So, and we can't, it's difficult to be constantly, heading into the fray all the time. So the free speech union discussion, I'm really annoyed at myself because one, I forgot to record it with my handheld recorder. It was recorded by the Free Speech Union, but I'm afraid I don't know what's going to come out of that. It's always good to have your own recording, but I thought my speech was very, very, hard hitting, and I'm going to be sad if there's no record of that. And I realize it was a bit in your face, a bit, but we kind of need that a little bit in this day and age. Um, anyway, so it was a fantastic event, and I thought the presentations were all excellent. And I'm hoping actually that I can get some of the people who are presenting to write up their presentation so that it can be published in the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship newsletter. So, Jonathan Kay, I sincerely apologize for calling you a coward. I don't think you're a coward. I think that the indigenization issue you're completely wrong on, and sensitivity makes no sense. And to say that when I went into the University of Manitoba, I assume, and did this event, grave error, the grave error counts as a hoax in front of the sacred fire, that's like me going into a church and telling people in the church that their beliefs are silly. It's not the same thing at all, because the problem is that the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation is supposed to be an academic body, and by it having the sacred fire in front of it is basically flying in the face of its own mandate as an academic, truth-telling, critical analysis, examining all the research that's available. It's violating the principles that it is supposed to be upholding. So there's not a problem of going into an academic institution and criticizing the violation of its academic character, which is bringing in religion into an academic space. That's a completely different situation than going into a church and telling the people in church that you don't believe in God. Those are two separate things. Anyway, I just wanted to get that off my chest because I think I'm accountable and I need to admit wrongdoing when I have done something which I think was problematic, and in this instance that I did. But I still want to take Jonathan Kay to task for, I think, completely wrong-headed views about how to tackle the unmarked graves deception that's going on. And I'm going to continue to go into these universities to try to hold them to account, like I'm going to be doing on December 2nd at 12:30 p.m. in front of the McPherson Library, which also has a sacred fire close by, which was burning for 4 days after UVic was putting forth the arguments that 215 children had been buried in unmarked graves. And in fact, the president said a mass grave at the Kamloops Indian Residential School. So I hope, for those in Victoria, I hope to see you on Tuesday, December 2nd. Have a great evening.